Alright guys, so after ranking all the Pokemon matchups with Ash vs. Paul in a Sinnoh League, I had to sit and think to myself, what is next? Well, not my most successful concept, I can't lie to y'all, this little series is kind of fire. But instead of instantly pivoting to one of the newer and trendy full battles, I thought we ought to rewind to the classics, get that out of the way. So today we're going to be ranking all the 1v1 Pokemon matchups with Ash vs. Gary at the Johto League. Keeping it real, this battle to me is not as great as it is for most others, so I ought to warn y'all I might not be as giddy happy with most of these matchups like with some of the other loved full battles. But to wrap up the beginning as soon as possible, let's just summarize the rules real quick. It should be noted that sweeps won't be counted as one matchup, nor will ones requiring multiple switches. Basically, all the two Pokemon have to do is actually battle in some way, shape, or form, and it'll be considered a matchup. It can be for 1 minute, 45 seconds, even 20 seconds. They scrap, it's in. So, without stalling any longer, let's get started.
Pokemon, stand by!
So, my number one worst matchup in this battle is no doubt Bayleef versus Blastoise. I'm not gonna sugarcoat this, I just can't get behind the fact that Bayleef, one of Ash's better Johto Pokemon, gets laid out in one move and doesn't even last a full minute. Sure, you can gas this up with how not even type advantages can stop Blastoise, or how this is good build up to show Blastoise's strengths by one-shotting her, but I just feel nothing out of either of these things. This might be heavy bias off rip, but I know her worth, and she shouldn't be getting laid out this badly. In terms of matchups in the battle that involved one Pokemon at full health, this was easily the laziest. And then at the second to last placement is Heracross versus, once again, Blastoise. Now, this one has a more organic and reasonable reason for not having it so high, and that is that nothing happens really. Like, I'm pretty sure most people know about the ending shot of the episode, but the issue is that the next episode just does something differently entirely. Like, it was initially First Swipes versus Hydro Pump. Cool, but the next episode just has Heracross hide behind a big rock. You can argue Ash changed his mind and pivoted towards defense, knowing Fury Swipes wasn't probably gonna be a Hydro Pump, but they should have just made that feel more natural. This has no bearing on the quality, mind you, but Glasgow versus Drapion is a good example. Scizor versus Pin Missile. Who's gonna win? Pin Missile. Boom. There we go. The funny thing is, this jarring transition isn't even the main problem, it's just that this cliffhanger move knocks Heracross right out. And this is what I mean by nothing really happens in this matchup. No style, no substance, just power gap, I guess. And afterwards is then Charizard versus Golem. Now, at this point, we're hitting the finale of the matchups I think are just really lazy. They did try interesting things with Golem, like how Charizard couldn't use Seismic Toss because of the weight, along with its typing making things pretty hard for Charizard to overcome as well. But then, for some reason, they just one-shot Golem with Dragon Rage, and I just can't get this nasty feeling out of my head that Golem was likely there just to be food. I don't say that often with most Pokemon in matchups, but this guy just generally felt like he was there to fill up space. Now again, I appreciate they tried to do some things with this matchup compared to the other two, but the intrigue was just thrown out the window as soon as it was brought up. Up next though is Snorlax versus Arcanine, which might be a hot take for having this low. Most of us love Snorlax's 2 back-to-back KOs in this battle, though I don't know how much that's applied individually. One good way to appreciate this is that it follows the consistency of Snorlax being abnormally strong, but there's just two critiques that I have, with the first being that it's almost, if not just as lazily written as the last three. Arcanine drops in with a Fire Spin for about 10 seconds maybe. Ash tells Snorlax to lock in and use Hyper Beam. The Hyper Beam just pierces through and just one-shots Arcanine. It gets more embarrassing that up until that last blow that actually hits, this matchup was lasting for about a good 25 seconds. Then the second critique is just more subjective, but it's how disappointing Arcanine was as a Gary Pokemon here. Most fans don't invest much in Rivals' Pokemon unless they're the ace or some super soldier powerhouse, but sometimes I like just to keep an eye on the ones that are simply recurring. The fact Arcanine gets done this dirty sort of ruins the investment I had in them, but just going Going back to the positive thoughts, this matchup easily clears the ones before, as one example is that it acts as a turnaround point for Ash in his battle. To give context, this part happens after the match's halfway intermission when Ash loses half of his team first, so him starting the second half using his canonical powerhouse to even odds was hype, I can't lie. But again, the treatment of Arcanine and the overall pacing hurts it quite a bit. Afterwards is Mike versus Blastoise, which between you and me was in the upper half at first. Lore drop, we know Muck is the almighty counter to physical attacks. They use that surprise factor to their advantage as a matter of fact. The weird thing though is that it's dropped significantly after some rewatches for how Muck gets forced to switch out. Ash commands it to surround and trap Blastoise, though Ash basically does nothing to follow up on this. It got to the point Gary got enough time to form a thought to come up with a counterattack, which is just so weirdly jarring because you really don't know what Ash's plan was here. Part of it is an anime pacing thing where time doesn't pass nearly as fast whenever there's commentary, but they just never show Ash react, give a command until it's already too late. And getting back to Muck's mostly physical immunity, they not only managed to survive more than one blow against Blastoise, but also briefly immobilize them, which is far better than the other two that fought before in the first half of the battle. This is also probably the best showing of Blastoise's 3-mon flex, as Hydro Pumping Muck from the inside, utilized both power and smarts, which clears the other two Blastoise examples in terms of just pure creativity. Alas, the confusing and vague strategy Ash had in the end just hurts it quite a lot. And right after, we got Snorlax versus Scizor. This, almost in a way, is a polar opposite of Muck versus Blastoise. With this one, it was a matchup that I initially thought to be very low, but got better as I rewatched a few times. Gary uses a Pokemon we never seen him use before, and takes out one of Ash's powerhouse in 20, maybe 30 seconds flat. It initially felt tasteless, did a disservice to a Pokemon of Snorlax's caliber, and was by a nobody, no less. But that way of thinking was actually the real problem. It's soulless when you try to process this matchup as fast as it's happening in real time, but let's slow down, okay? Try understanding what's really going on. After the matchup with Nidoqueen, Gary realized Snorlax isn't just strong, but also fast. He was gonna save Blastoise towards the end, and with Golem, they were likely gonna meet the same fate as Nidoqueen had he tried to do power versus power again. So, Gary opted to fight speed with speed. That makes sense as a pivot to taking out Snorlax, and thinking like that made this go from bad to actually tolerable. And seeing as this is Snorlax's third matchup in a row with no breaks, it makes sense that diminishing health and stamina ran its course. It's like Electivire versus Gliscor, where it acts more as riding a Pokemon off to progress the battle because the KO'd Pokemon had already done its purpose. So that point, along with the very little time we can soak into it, it stops it from putting it farther. This level of averageness basically acts as the border between not so good to the, well, I wouldn't necessarily say good, but better matchups. So next up is Snorlax versus Nidoqueen. Not clear of the other two Snorlax matchups, but confidently the best out of the three. Like mentioned earlier, Nidoqueen is there to fight power with power, and they even acknowledge this with how she also has Hyper Beam. Not to mention, as a Gary Pokemon, she's been pretty solid. No different Team Rocket in her debut, and no different Tauros, a pretty solid Ashmon in the beginning of the battle. But again, one of the biggest things I like about the matchup is just how it hypes Snorlax up to be this absurd powerhouse. This matchup fell in Ash's favor because Gary didn't fathom it had some speed on it, which is kinda interesting because you don't really have Ash's opponent to make such grave miscalculations that often. And then there's also just the Snorlax compliments I gave back in the Arcanine matchup, which can kinda just be copy and pasted here. If I had one problem, it's that Nidoqueen also gets done a little dirty, but a lot of the good stuff that happens in this matchup makes up for it to be a little bit more forgivable. Moving on, we got Charizard versus Scizor. Nothing overly complex or anything, probably one of the most simple actually. I just like that Ash is down to his last Pokemon up against Scizor, who basically stopped all momentum Ash was riding on, and Charizard just negatives, bro. You can just feel the aura, the presence Charizard carries, to the point that even when Ash is 1-3, you just know he can kind of turn this around. It's especially hype that he's the last one standing because this is the first time he's sent out to not just this battle, battle, but this league entirely, the timing, execution, all of that just exudes ace energy. But that's basically it. It's actually kind of a flawless matchup, to be honest. No problems. It's extremely short, but the fact they wasted zero time on it is ironically a good thing, though it can't really be any higher just for how the positives can only take it so far, but it's admittedly still a respectable spot. Hype moments in aura, but actually good. And coming in just barely outside of the top 3 is Muck versus Scizor. Surprisingly, this was one I did not expect to get that high, mainly for how I always hated that Muck essentially jobs and never fights in an official battle ever again. While that still sucks, I think Muck in this battle played an admirable role, even if it didn't rack up any KOs. Its feats with Blastoise is one example, but how Muck gets defeated elevates Gary as a trainer for his ingenuity. Based on first-hand experience with 2 of his Pokemon, Gary understood that Muck's physical strike negation was the only thing going for it. As shown with Blastoise, Muck is still susceptible to projectiles, so using Swift to deplete its HP kinda came in full circle. I say projectiles because Swift is still technically physical in Gen 2. And I also wanted to use this opportunity to gas up Gary's Scizor a bit because they were basically a mini powerhouse of their own too. Their feats are pretty good, and like said with their bout with Charizard, they force Ash back into the wall by reversing his momentum. Overall, pretty solid, well written in the battle direction in my opinion, but the rest of the list just has stuff going on that just made it better than this. And before we actually reveal what the 3rd place spot is, let's just show the top 3. In no order, mind you, just basically what we all have left. So the ones we have remaining are Heracross versus Magmar, Tauros versus Nidoqueen, and Charizard versus Blastoise. And while we're at it, you can even join in a little game. Try to see how well the order you've arranged in your head matches the one I'm about to give, alright? I'm assuming you might have formed your order by the time I'm finishing this sentence, so we good? Okay, great. At number 3, we have Charizard versus Blastoise. Now, I know this doesn't look good right now. One of the most iconic showdowns in the anime, and it's top 3 in this battle at 3rd. Alright, so let me just rip the band-aid straight off and explain my reasoning. First off, Charizard and Blastoise, honestly, don't really have any good battle chemistry. Charizard didn't have a natural way of matching Blastoise with his own power and skill, and was basically just forced to play a near infinite game of keep away. If Charizard was far, Blastoise could just spam Hydro Pump, tries to get approached, sneaks him with a Skull Bash. It was only until Ash took advantage of the stadium's environment that he could do something. Nothing wrong with taking advantage of the stadium, of course, it's just that the environment being the only way to progress and stand a chance took away from the believability in their relative power. Then lastly on my list of problems is practically just almost everything once we hit that turnaround point. The point of Charizard to get close was that his fire moves could actually be somewhat effective, but while I could ignore they opted for Dragon Rage instead in that scene, I just can't ignore they try once, fail, and move straight on from that plot point. They immediately resort to Charizard's win button, which not only works, but it one-shots Blastoise. Like overall, it's kind of just clunky. 2 Pokemon that don't bounce off well, and a fair bit of questionable writing decisions. But in small defense of this battle, it's not entirely bad, just mid or slightly below or above mid, depending on the day. Another good thing is that it plays to the trainers' traits, mainly Ash. Gary's familiar with how unpredictable Ash can be, but the latter's just so good at coming up with anything that Gary's prior knowledge still had him baffled. And I guess one last thing that also carried it this far was just the achievement factor behind this. I think for what this stands for in terms of Ash's progression, finally beating his main rival, works perfectly with how it closes off with Charizard of all Pokemon. Combining both my critique and my enjoyment / lingering respect, this was the furthest spot I felt comfortable with. And coming in at 2nd is Heracross versus Magmar. Now, I don't know if people would have put it above Charizard versus Blastoise specifically, but I know for sure this would have been number 3 or number 2 for most people. For me personally, it feels weird to see it get this far because I'm going to say that this battle is severely overrated. A lot of it has to do with how exaggerated people are when it comes to gassing up feats for the potential mon himself, Heracross. In terms of the general Ashmon feats, this isn't really all that remarkable, but so many times will this be treated as a powerhouse performance. Even with my personal gripes, it's definitely still number 2 for a good reason. This is heavily in conjunction with Tauros vs Nidoqueen because the latter was like a greeting from Gary, giving Ash a taste of how he fights. But something just so sick with this is that it's flipped here. This is a greeting from Ash and showing Gary how he fights. Using super effective moves and generally high powered ones can get you a solid KO, sure, but sometimes when you're up against Ash Ketchum, bro, he is not gonna care. Let him do his thing and he's gonna somehow find a way to pop off. It's also nice that Heracross gets a special win because Snorlax and Charizard hog literally every other KO in the entire battle. And one last thing that puts this astronomically high is just the pacing, to be honest. It's shoved in the last 2 to 3 minutes of the episode, but it had a decent flow. Heracross does decent damage, Magmar retaliates with more damage, Heracross survives off just guts, not the ability, and clutches out of a corner to get a win. A well-balanced exchange, didn't overstay its welcome, didn't end too early, just the right amount. People already really love this matchup, but it's scary how naturally good it is compared to most of the others in the list. No offense. But now it's time for the number 1 spot. There's a really good chance you're surprised it got this far, but above both Charizard versus Blastoise and Heracross versus Magmar 2, the number 1 matchup we have is Tauros versus Nidoqueen. Upon rewatching, this matchup was actually kinda good. Similar to the Muck situation to where I really didn't like how they did Tauros, but respected it after a closer look. But as I watched more of the battle, with more matchups being added to the list, this still managed to be around the top. It wasn't number 1 at first, but just looking at the pros and cons, this was ironically the most flawless. Let me explain what makes it so good. One thing for sure is what I mentioned previously, with this being Gary's way of saying hello. It's all in the presentation and delivery. If he can, he will go for super effective moves, and if you're open, he will hit you with something strong. This has always been a Gary staple, but there's just this sense of efficiency in his battling style, and it's never boring. It's also just intimidating with the tone in Gary's voice when he commands a hyper beam as the finishing blow, and just has his arms folded for almost a good full minute. And Ash being the first to receive a KO works perfect because it showed a quick and easier result of what happens when trying to battle so casually against an opponent of Gary's caliber. This and Gary's cold demeanor was basically just telling Ash that he needs to lock in. But notice how that perfectly alley-oops into the Heracross versus Magmar matchup, planting seeds into Ash giving an introduction of his own, showing how he can get the job done himself. Oh, and one thing I forgot to mention too is that the champion theme plays here. So in that 1 minute where everything I just described happens, you got one of the most tense themes in the game to kickstart this battle off in the background. And on a side note, I like Nidoqueen's performance, by the way, as she was one of the few recurring Gary Pokemon. Even rivals have jobber Pokemon, but it's kind of cool Nidoqueen ain't one of them. Similar to Heracross vs Magmar, the flow's decent, I vibe with exchanges, and just like with Charizard vs Scizor, the short and abrupt length actually plays to its strengths. It really sounds crazy, but I generally think this battle might have peaked in the beginning, at least with the individual matchups. It set the tone, to the point that I don't even know if Ash vs Gary could even be considered Ash vs Gary if it wasn't for this intro. Y'all might not think I'm cooking, but this is my answer to what I think is the best matchup in this battle. And with that, that is the whole list. At least for me, this ranking in a way has a different aura compared to the Ash vs Paul one. It's probably because I don't love this battle as much, but some of the rankings definitely felt a lot harsher just going over the script here. But no doubt I still had fun doing this one because a lot of the rankings were scaringly close in quality, which made it harder but more interesting to break down, whether that's for better or for worse. No point in yapping too much though. Feel free to let me know what you thought of the ranking. I can't guarantee when, but if I do another one of these, I'd like it to be from Kalos, but we'll just have to wait and see. Other than that, that's pretty much all I got for now. Yep.
Do it now!